Next, Mr. Alan Thomas, Senior Director of Thought Leadership at IQVIA Solutions Japan, will give a lecture entitled Japan R&D and Clinical Development Landscape. Now, Mr. Thomas, please come up to the stage.
Firstly, I hope you, your family, friends and colleagues are all doing well as we head into the end of the first quarter and the beginning of the next Japan fiscal year, which starts in a few days. And as a result of that shift into the next fiscal year, we're going to see a number of policy initiatives and changes occurring in the Japanese market in the next 12 to 18 months. The title that we saw on the screen, I was actually given as well. So I thank the organizers for allowing me to speak today, and I thank you for your time. So I'm going to give an update on Japan, the R&D clinical trial landscape, and investment in innovation in what is the second largest branded pharmaceutical market globally. Now, the Japan pharmaceutical market is not the black box that many people still perceive the market to be. Japan's healthcare, R&D, and clinical trial and regulatory landscape is more aligned with the other top 6 developed markets today than ever before. Japan has regained its significance and appeal for R&D-driven companies as the pharmaceutical market continues to offer considerable opportunities. And I'll highlight how things have changed over the last 8 to 12 years and is driving attractiveness for investment in R&D and innovation in Japan. I'll start with Japan's global position. I'll talk about some advances in Japan healthcare policy. I'll highlight innovation-driven opportunities. And the last couple of slides will look at the Japan forecast through 2030. It says closing and discussions. If we have time, we will do that. I always like to have a few questions. If not, I'll be available later today throughout the session for questions. So where does Japan sit globally? Now, Japan dropped to the 4th ranked country by total pharmaceutical spend in 2024. We maintained that position last year. And we were the 3rd ranked market 2020 through 2023, as you can see on the chart, but we actually dropped below 5% share of global pharmaceutical spend in 2021. And we can see the US, China, and Germany take the top 3 spots. That being said, the Japanese government has implemented measures aimed at controlling healthcare costs with a specific focus on pharmaceutical spend, and they have effectively managed that top-line growth. However, growth continues to emerge here with innovation, specialty biologics, orphan rare diseases, oncology, immunology, and neurology all showing very strong growth potential. And we saw from our previous presentation that a number of these areas have a high focus in current R&D pipelines. Now, these represent significant opportunities for pharmaceutical companies as they're looking to invest. And companies like yourselves, joint venture, biotech, emerging biopharma, have the same opportunities for growth. Now, top-line spend is managed. We're number 4 globally. However, for branded pharmaceuticals, Japan remains the 2nd largest market behind the US. And interestingly, the rankings of the top 10 countries by branded spend hasn't changed in the last 5-6 years. Again, we're managing top-line healthcare and pharmaceutical spend, but we remain the 2nd largest opportunity for innovation and R&D-driven companies. And if we look at contribution to spend from newly launched products that have been launched between 2021 and 2025, Japan is the 2nd largest market for innovation. So globally, the US leads in terms of contribution from new launches, new global launches. We are number 2, followed by Germany, Spain. A little lower down is China. And just as a quick takeaway, I talked about Japan being the second largest branded pharmaceutical market. The branded market here in Japan is worth around $60 billion, give or take. China is about 25 to 28 billion. It's a much smaller branded opportunity. And more interestingly, around 70% of global launches in the last 5 years included Japan as first country or within 1 year of global launch. If we go back 10, 12 years, that number would be less than 50%. Japan historically was the second or third wave country of launch. Now we are first or second wave country of launch. Again, the perception that we are a black box and market access is more challenging, that's a 10, 15-year-old mindset. And we will see through a number of initiatives that have been introduced and policy and healthcare focus is moving Japan closer to where we are in the rest of the world. And that's what we're going to touch on now, advances in healthcare policy. Now, there have been multiple initiatives introduced over the last few years. Japan has been actively involved in the development, and we were one of the first signatory countries to the ICH guidelines when they were first implemented. Japan has introduced what we call the Sakigake, which is Japan's equivalent to the US Breakthrough Therapy Designation System. We've expanded fast track and priority review here in Japan. We've introduced conditional early approval, and pricing policy has shifted to reward innovation and protect price under the price maintenance premium. These are government initiatives that have been implemented over the last 3 to 8 years and have positively impacted the attractiveness and level of investment that we're seeing in patient outcomes and innovation and drug availability here in Japan. I've got some stats as well. Like my colleague previously, there are some data-heavy slides, but these are very important slides to highlight. If we look at the median approvals time in Japan versus rest of the world, we can see that in 2024, drug approval times were the fastest here in Japan versus the other major approvals and regulatory agencies. Go back 10, 15 years, we were the slowest. So we've moved from the least to the fastest. And on the right, we can see the 2024 data for the median approval time for standard review and priority review. And I just realized I spelled priority wrong there. Now, in Europe, there were no priority reviews in 2024, so that data point is 0. But we can see for Japan, the third data point, very short timelines for approvals. And what that has also contributed to is the average development time in Japan has decreased. You know, we saw a lot of the clinical trial numbers and the focus in biologics and elsewhere. What we're also seeing is that Japan's inclusion in global or multi-regional clinical trials has increased considerably. The requirements for phase 1 or early phase 2 in Japan have been lifted for a lot of Japan inclusion, with bridging studies allowing a shorter and less expensive path to market. And we can see, and I apologize, the latest data point is 2019, but we can see between 2024 and 2019 that there was a considerable improvement in the average development time here in Japan. So the level of investment, not just financially, but in terms of time, has improved considerably and is opening up attractiveness here in Japan. But what's more important is the drug lag. Now, the drug lag, when we talk about Japan, is the gap between first global launch and Japan launch. I mentioned a few slides ago that Japan has shifted from second, third, or even fourth wave country of launch to the first or second wave country of launch. And we can see, if we compare 3-year launch brackets, back in the 2014-2016 launches in Japan, patients in Japan were waiting 27 months longer on average to gain access to global therapies. In the last 3 years, that's dropped down to just 12 months. There's still areas for improvement, but clearly, companies focusing and launching and bringing treatment options to Japan is far superior today than it ever has been. But most importantly, as I mentioned a couple of comments ago, patient access to global therapies has improved considerably. We've also seen the introduction of what's called the in-country clinical caretaker. And this is a relatively new initiative that was introduced by the Japanese government. Companies are now able to develop in Japan without having to establish a physical presence. You do not have to have a legal entity in Japan. It's mandatory, however, to appoint a local legal representative. And that representative is known as the ICCC, or In-Country Clinical Caretaker. Now, the ICCC is responsible for ensuring that the clinical trial protocols and all other requirements are followed as per guidelines. But the key takeaway here is that you can work with an existing company in Japan to act as your agent without you having to invest in a presence. Now, we're seeing a lot of emerging biopharma, and I have a slide coming up that shows this, that have taken advantage of this program and are working with a local Japanese partner for the early development. They may shift and take over development, they may license commercialization, they may independently market that product. But the hurdle to market access has lowered as a result of not having to invest in establishing a physical presence. Now, I mentioned Japan inclusion as part of that shift in decrease in development timelines. Japan inclusion in multi-regional clinical trials has increased considerably. So here we have clinical trials in Japan. These are based on active clinical trials as reported by the PMDA, and the number of trials that are Japan only versus Japan included in a global or multi-regional study. So back in 2028, around 15% of clinical trials in Japan were a part of a global study. In 2024, that increased to 65%. And again, if we look at that conditional early approval, if we look at Sakigake, if we look at that fast-track opportunity, these are allowing companies to pull Japan in and launch in Japan faster than ever before. I mentioned requirements for phase 1, early phase 2, the increased use of bridging studies, and allowing Japan inclusion into a global study when there's no ethnicity issue around the clinical trial design is allowing companies to come into Japan faster. And we're seeing Japan inclusion in those trials increasing considerably. We saw already a couple of slides on the share of clinical trials by phase, and I just want to point out in 2022 and 2024, you can see that the number of phase 1 or the share of phase 1 phases in Japan actually decreased. And again, that's on the back of multinationals, emerging biopharma, biotech not having to conduct phase 1 in Japan and being able to pull Japan into that global study. And we're going to see a continued decline in that phase 1 share of total trials as companies pull Japan in phase 2, early phase 3, and many examples as well. I'm having trouble with the clicker today. But what's more important is that there has been an increase in Japan inclusion by big pharma as well. So the chart on the screen is based on large pharma companies, companies with more than 10 billion in global sales. And what we tracked here was country inclusion in clinical trial starts. And we can see on the left there, the US had the largest share of starts across these big pharma. But what we see for Japan is that Japan is as likely as Europe to be included in a global study. But more importantly, if we look at the line graph, we can see that across all phases, 2024 versus 2014, 2016 averages, the average number in phase 1, 2, and 3 in 2024 was noticeably higher than 5-6 years ago. More trials in Japan are being pulled into global studies by Big Pharma. Now, Big Pharma always had a strong presence, but that drug lag we saw was driven by Big Pharma delaying a decision to bring a product to market. They're not delaying that decision anymore, and we're seeing that increase in inclusion. I have a couple of slides for emerging biopharma and biotech, but it's important to point out here that all players globally are looking at Japan differently and are reinvesting in Japan and taking advantage of growing opportunities. Again, I'm in trouble with the clicker. Here we go. Now, we saw a number of slides previously that showed that China has a considerably larger pipeline than Japan. But what I wanted to highlight is that a large share of clinical trials in China are China only. In fact, if we look at the 1,662 ongoing clinical trials active in China today, only 272 of those are global or multi-regional. Whereas Japan, we have around 600 clinical trials. However, we can see that 380 or so of those are part of a global study. So while the number of trials here is considerably smaller, Japan involvement in global and regional trials is higher than what we're seeing in China. Now, I'm highlighting this because everyone's saying, oh, clinical development, China, it's really, really growing, it's expanding. Yeah, but it's country-specific. And in many instances, that country-specific trial is a follow-on or a me-too. Thus, there's no opportunity for that compound to gain a global footprint, a global presence. That is shifting. We're seeing a lot of innovation coming out of China, don't get me wrong. But in terms of opportunity, again, our branded market is twice as big as China, and the number of trials here that are a part of a multi-regional or global is also considerably higher. Now, as a result of all of these initiatives, and as a result of I'm going to use the word investment, that the PMDA, the Korosho, MHLW, the investment that government's been making to increase the attractiveness and improve a lot of the metrics that we just saw, we can see that Japan, compared to the other major regulatory agencies, we are faring very, very well. So the flags represent the countries, obviously, and we can see the Japan flag. Speed, we're number one. We saw that with the regulatory approvals and the shrinking development timelines. Simplicity, there are complications in all markets, but again, the attractiveness is not too bad. Transparency is an issue, obviously being able to provide all documentation in Japanese and understanding all of the requirements for submission is a little less clear in Japan than, say, the European markets, China to a degree as well. But flexibility, we're showing improvements as well. If I were to plot this graph 10 years ago, that Japan flag would be far more towards the left, rating less compared to the other regulatory agencies. So the government's making investments. I don't have a slide, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with the PMDA opening a satellite office in Washington recently, well, a year or so, give or take. Again, to bridge the discussion between US biotech, emerging biopharma, and opportunities in the Japan market. And that will not change. That focus on bringing treatment options, outcomes to patients in Japan will continue to be a key focus of government policy. We can talk about pricing and other issues on a separate timeline, but again, all other elements of healthcare policy are encouraging investment in Japan. So I wrote this the other day before I sent the document. MHLW initiatives to reward investment in innovation have directly improved patient access to safer and more effective therapies earlier than ever before. And I can't reinforce this more strongly. It's a very, very strong position for Japan to be in. Again, my clicker's not working. There we go. Now, we were talking about Japan showing a lot of innovation, being the second largest branded market, also being the second largest market for contribution from global launches in the last 5 years. And there are a lot of innovation-driven opportunities. But there's also a lot of areas that Japan needs to improve and shift focus and grow. But we are seeing all of the initiatives highlighted, the improvements in regulatory and development timelines, making Japan attractive, as we've seen. Now, if we look at the new brands launched in Japan in the last 5 years. So these are products that were new to market. It excludes combination products unless a combination product has an original molecule with an existing molecule. So existing combination products are excluded from this analysis. And this is looking at the R&D origin of those launches. And we can see of those 180, give or take, new brand launches in the last 5 years, 35% of those brands originated from emerging biopharma pipelines. 62 of the launches in the last 5 years were originated from emerging biopharma. We can see small and mid-sized pharma contributing far less, with large pharma contributing for around 45% of the origin of development. However, emerging biopharma are less likely to commercialize at this time. They are bringing innovation to market, and then they're licensing or partnering on the commercialization of those assets. So just 17 products, 9.5% of that 35%, are EBP developing and retaining commercial rights here in Japan. So you're investing in patient outcomes, but you're not necessarily commercializing that investment. In fact, 25% of all products launched in the last 5 years developed, discovered by EBP, but out-licensed. Now, we've seen a shift over the last 5 years, more so than 10 years. If I were to reproduce this chart for launches between 2005, 2010, and so on, we would see that the share of origin is increasing, and the share of retention for commercialization is also increasing. But still a clear strategy for emerging biopharma is to develop and then license for commercialization. Again, clicker's not working. There we go. Now, on a couple of slides ago, I didn't read on the slide. A couple of years ago, the Health Ministry introduced a program to address the drug loss here in Japan. So I mentioned the drug lag. The drug lag is the gap between global launch and Japan launch. The drug loss, however, are products or indications that are not in development in Japan. And a large share of those products are from emerging biopharma, who did not necessarily have the resources to invest in Japan. However, with the in-country clinical caretaker, we're seeing that shift and partnering for a representative. So if we were to look at the 545 launches in the 2014 to 2022 timeframe, we can see that there were a large number, and there still are, a large number of global launches that do not yet include Japan. And this is not even touching on indication, which is a part of that drug loss discussion that the Korosho is having with the industry. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to look at, of those global launches, how many included the European markets, the US, and Japan. And we can see that only 52% of global launches, 2014 to 2022, only half of those have made it to Japan. Now, there are a number of them that are currently in development, and upcoming launches in the next 2 to 5 years will increase. But clearly, there is a lost opportunity, and clearly, patient access in Japan to those global launches is still an issue that needs to be addressed. And if we look, and as I mentioned, a large share of products. Now, I'm specifically looking here now at 103 launches in the US that have yet to be launched in Japan. And these US launches were between 2019 and 2022. So of those 103 US available products not available here, 60% were emerging biopharma originated products. Yet we saw emerging biopharma increasing investment and having a larger share of recent launches. There's still a lot of opportunity as these companies look to future invest in Japan. Now, some of those 103 products may have seen a follow-on launch or a subsequent launch that has made the original launch less attractive, and therefore we're not going to see all of these products. Let's be sure on that point. However, we can still see that Japan, although the second largest market, although attractiveness has increased considerably, the level of investment is still showing opportunity here in Japan. And more importantly, if we look across diseases, and we saw some data in the previous series of slides as well, oncology dominates the pipeline. And we can see that there were 41 oncologic launches in the US that have yet to be launched in Japan. And a large share of those, 21, over half of them, are in that emerging biopharma. We can see neurology, infectious diseases, immunology, a few other categories there, but quite clearly, that neurology, oncology opportunity here in Japan is going to continue to grow. I'm going to close now, and I only have a couple of minutes left, and we may have time for one or two questions, is Japan's outlook. As I said, top-line spend in Japan, well managed. Obviously, 2020, the global market, Japan included, was impacted by the COVID outbreak at that time. And one of the key contributing slowdowns in Japan was actually a decrease in total treated patient numbers. Patients restricted themselves from accessing medical institutions for fear of coming into contact with a COVID-positive patient. There were no restriction on movement limitations. You could still travel here in Japan, but the number of patients declined considerably. We saw a rebound through the last 3-4 years, and again, that top-line growth well managed. Looking forward, that top-line growth will continue to be well managed. Again, pricing initiatives here in Japan are effectively managing healthcare spend and pharmaceutical spend and will continue to do so. But this does not look attractive. Who wants to invest in a market where we've got 1 to 1.5% compound growth potential in the next 5 years? Oh, my apologies, I didn't point out this is a fiscal year base. The reason that I'm sharing fiscal year with you today is that the NHI pricing system is based on a fiscal year from April 1st through to end of March. So I wanted to represent the impact of pricing policy on the fiscal year. Calendar year, you get slightly different numbers because the impact of the price cuts vary differently. But protected brands here in Japan in the next 5 years will grow 12.4% compound. Again, flat top line growth. But we're going to see 12.5% growth for protected innovation. And this includes contribution from launches in the next 5 years. We're going to see specialty and biologics continue to increase their share of total spend in Japan as we see an increase in the number of specialty and biologic products launched in Japan and indications for these products expand. Obviously, there's a considerable overlap in specialty biologics, autoimmune, oncology definitions, and they're both going to grow. In fact, grow quite strongly. Now, I mentioned we're going to see 12.5% compound growth. This is a complicated chart, but it's also a very, very easy one. Last year, protected brands sold 7.3 trillion yen. However, 37% of spend last year is for products that will lose protection at some point in the next 5 years. They will shift out of the protected market, which means that those products that were protected last year and will remain protected will grow from 4.6 trillion to 6.7 trillion. They will grow 7.7% compound. There aren't many markets globally where we're going to see 7 to 8% compound growth for brands. And if we add in contribution from upcoming launches, we get that 12.5% compound growth. That's where the opportunity exists. As you continue to invest in the pipeline, as you continue to invest in bringing treatments to market, you will see a reward on that investment with strong growth opportunities. While Japan still manages healthcare spend, drug spend, relatively flat at that top line. Now it says here I have 56, 7, I've gone over. It's counting the wrong way. I guess we don't have time for questions. Again, I thank you for your time. I will be around most of the day as well if you have any questions later. But I can't reiterate how the government policy initiatives that's coming out of Korosho, coming out of the PMDA, how they're allowing innovation to advance in Japan. And that innovation, I will be honest, is not being driven by Japanese companies. It's being driven by global players as they continue to see the attractiveness of Japan. I will wrap it up before I get in big trouble for going over too long. I thank you for your time and I look forward to chatting with you throughout today's session. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas.